My name is David Frank. I'm the Dean of the Robert D. Clark Honors College, and I'm delighted that you have braved the storm to witness what we think is a historic event. And that event is that we are trying to talk about a revolution that's taking place in the Middle East, primarily in the Arab countries, and we want to bring to you the voices of those who are in those countries. And so you'll see behind me two screens, one with a colleague from the Sudan to my right, to your left, and then a colleague to my left, your right, who is speaking through Skype, and he is in Iraq. And so our hope is to illuminate for you the reasons why there is a revolution ongoing in the Arab world, and to bring to bear some of our scholarly insights that will then allow you to have a better understanding of why the revolution is ongoing and where it might go. And so we see this event as a prelude, as a first event in what we're launching tonight, which is a collaboration with the Carnegie Council. And the Carnegie Council is located in New York. It is designed to sound the voice of ethics in international affairs. And to talk with you briefly about our collaboration, I've asked Professor Cheney Ryan, who is a professor in philosophy and who is also a professor in the Merton College at Oxford University, to talk about the vision that we have that engages Carnegie with the University of Oregon. Dr. Ryan.
Very quickly, so my name is Cheney Ryan. For 35 years, I was a professor at the University of Oregon. Now I split my time with Oxford University, where I am starting a new program on peace and nonviolence in the politics department. One of my major goals in doing that is to provide opportunities for University of Oregon students to work abroad and to turn the University of Oregon into the leading campus in the United States dealing with issues of peace, conflict, and nonviolence. We will have a collaboration that will be announced in May with the Carnegie Council, as David said, in New York, which will provide a lot of opportunities for students to work on these issues, particularly issues of global ethics. And so I just wanted to say a word tonight to look out for that. We will have the president of Carnegie here announcing that. One of the things we will be doing as part of this partnership is ongoing programs linking together students and faculty and young people from around the globe. So this, as David said, the first sort of pre-event in that project, which I think will become very exciting and very important part of the university. So in any event, it's great to see people here tonight. I'm going to give it back to David.
Our first speaker tonight is Dennis Simon. He is our new Vice Provost for International Affairs. He is a scholar of China, and I believe that because China is playing such an important role, his insights on how the Chinese are responding to the Arab Revolution will be illuminating for you. So he'll speak between 6 and 7 minutes, and then we'll move to Shaul Cohen.
Thank you, David, and again, thank you all for coming tonight. Indeed, it's a great privilege to be here to address all of you. I think this is the kind of important event that the University of Oregon is trying to promote as part of the internationalization of what we do here on campus. So I look forward to having you and your colleagues hopefully attend more of these. As David said, I do a lot of work on China, and those of you who may have seen the New York Times this weekend and on Sunday may have seen an editorial that was written, an op-ed piece, about whether or not the so-called Jasmine Revolution was indeed going to spread to China. And there have been a lot of rumblings across the Chinese political terrain over the last several weeks, basically as Chinese leaders keep close tabs over what's been going on in the Middle East. And you can be sure that, in fact, in Zhongnanhai, where most Chinese leaders live, you can be sure that this has been, in fact, a topic of conversation among the Politburo members and the top echelon of the Chinese Communist Party. Several weeks ago, just as events were developing in Egypt, the Chinese government also began a slow but very steady crackdown, as what they began to see in the web world and in the blogs coming across the Chinese social networks was the beginnings of a series of discussions among Chinese dissidents about whether or not, in fact, Chinese people, the Chinese citizens ought to, in fact, mobilize in their own form of a quiet revolution. In 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party took power, some people suggest at least there were 3 reasons why they were able to come to power. That is, the Kuomintang regime, the existing regime, suffered from 3 major problems: massive corruption, massive inequality across the society, and huge inflation. If you look at Chinese society today, even despite the success of the last 30 years of economic reform, the society is also suffering from at least 2 of those major maladies. There's massive corruption and there's massive inequality. And inequality is growing in China faster than in any developing country since the end of World War II. So again, you have a growing disparity of incomes between rural and urban China. And you have a great deal of dissatisfaction with political leaders, particularly at the local level, because of the massive incidence of corruption. And therefore, you have at least the seeds of a great deal of discontent that is bubbling, at least below the surface in China. So on a series of weekends, there had been a lot of discussion in the internet, and people had agreed that they would show up on a street, Wangfujing in Beijing, and that would be a kind of quiet form of dissidence that they wanted to exhibit. But the Chinese police, both the internet police and the real police on the ground, actually caught wind of this, and artificially they pretended there was a construction problem within the street that they had to solve, and they cordoned off the street, thus preventing any kind of gathering from developing. And they, in effect, were able to preempt the emergence of any kind of cohort from demonstrating, even if they were to do so in a very quiet or nonviolent kind of way. And in fact, the last several weeks have seen an ongoing tightening up inside the Chinese political system, very much in response to developments that they've been watching across the Middle East. Chinese embassies in these particular countries have been extremely active in sending back their observations about what's been going on. The Chinese government, in a number of cases, as you may have read in the press, has pulled out their citizens, people working in the country, for fear of the security of these people. But most important, we've seen inside of China a kind of reaction, a rather conservative reaction, at a time when a lot of people thought that this regime was primed to begin a process of political opening. And just the opposite has happened. And in this New York Times article that I was talking about on Sunday, one of the most interesting elements of that was that it was an article about why the Chinese middle class will not help to foment basically a Jasmine Revolution type event in China. And it was about the vested interests of people who have a growing stake in preserving their particular social status and economic status, and thus we're not going to surrender that status in terms of risking everything for the promotion of some kind of democratic movement in China. So most people have become particularly sanguine about the potential for the development of what we would call Western-style democracy in China, and particularly after the crackdown over the last few weeks, I think people have become somewhat concerned, in fact, that this leadership is not going to give an inch in allowing even the slightest bit of activity to emerge that might result in some kind of cataclysmic attack against the Chinese Communist Party and what the regime represents. So while developments are proceeding ahead in other parts of the world, in China we don't see that kind of progress. And for a lot of people that's very dismaying, particularly the people in China who have at least thought that they could quietly help to foment a kind of gradual, if not steady, opening up. So it's a rather disappointing conclusion I leave you with, but it doesn't look like the Jasmine Revolution is going to make its way to China, at least in the short term. And so while we may see this kind of activity developing across other parts of the Middle East, in China for a while, I think we're just going to hold our breath watching what happens, because I think the Chinese Communist Party's grasp on what's going on remains very, very tight, and it doesn't look like there's going to be any kind of breakthrough right now. So I'll stop there and hand the mic back to David. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Shaul Cohen, who is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Oregon. He has been recently appointed a Carnegie Fellow of Global Ethics. He's written widely on issues related to the Middle East and in Northern Ireland, and he'll give you a 6, 7, 8-minute crystallization of everything you need to know about the Middle East.
That's not true, and I was offered 10 minutes, so we'll see what I can do with that time. I want essentially to contextualize the events of the past few months as a phenomenon that has deeper historical roots and broader regional implications in the years to come. And to say, in essence, we can get some sense of what led to this, but we don't necessarily know where it's going. And I'll offer, by way of example, another event from the region. On December 9th, 1987, an Israeli military vehicle plowed into a crowd of pedestrians in the Gaza Strip, setting off the first Palestinian Intifada. It doesn't make sense, though, to say that the Intifada began that day, but rather to look at the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, tracing it back to the root causes of the circumstances that made that spark possible and led to that reaction to a specific event. The reaction was comprehensive, it had some widespread ambitions, and it didn't, for the most part, achieve its goals. It did indeed bring Palestinians to a new place in the political framework. From that time onward, we speak of Israelis and Palestinians. Prior to that time, it was the Israeli-Arab conflict. Something definitely changed, but Palestinians are still unfortunately waiting for their state. It didn't deliver what they wanted it to deliver. So was it significant? Absolutely. Is it completed? Not yet. Did it begin that day? In a sense, yes, but very much in a sense it began much earlier. For the Middle East as a whole, I would argue the events which led up to the recent developments began with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. When we look at the role of the British Empire in creating the map of the region, in dividing peoples, in creating state territories, in setting in motion a politics which has kept most of the people of the region disenfranchised since then. Not that they were necessarily enfranchised before, but the situation perpetuates their position of weakness vis-a-vis whatever the ruling entity is. Since that time, we've been moving forward inexorably towards a situation where people would say that something needs to change and they need to be enfranchised. And that, I think, is the message that we're able to derive from the series of events that have been taking place in the countries of the region. Lisa Anderson, a professor at American University in Cairo, is referring to this as a revolution of dignity, not a revolution of ideology. And I think that that's a very apt term. People in the region have been denied by outside powers, but they've also been denied by their own governments of some basic human rights and their basic dignity. And they've now expressed their frustration with that situation and their desire to have a fundamental shift in the way things will be for them in their home countries. Will they achieve that? I suspect not very much in the near term, hopefully to some degree in the long term. But in the few remaining minutes that I have, I want to just take a look and share with you some of the indicators that would suggest to us that an explosion of this sort was bound to happen sometime. We wouldn't have known exactly when, we wouldn't have known exactly how. For some time, I've been expecting that Egypt would be a place for an eruption of this sort. So really quickly, and there's a lot that we won't cover, of course, this evening, just some basic indicators. So population growth. If you look at the region and you see 104 million in 1950 and 432 million in the year 2007, and projections for a 50% increase in the decades to come, it's going to stress any government to deal with that rapid pace of population growth. So you can't use this to form conclusions, but from that type of population growth, you can form a hypothesis that governments are going to struggle to provide for the needs of their citizens unless they're very wealthy. And though the Middle East does have wealth associated with oil, that wealth is distributed in particular ways. That means that it's not accessible to the bulk of the population. From the overall numbers of population growth for the region, we could go to median age of the population in Middle Eastern and North African countries, and some comparators down at the bottom. And you can see that this is a region of very young people, rapid population growth rates. The rates are changing, they're slowing down some, but still, enormous bulges at the younger age of these populations. Those are people that need to be provided for, many of them born and raised in poverty, and knowing that as the status quo has it, their needs are not going to be addressed by their governments. So there's a large population there that's hoping for a better future and not seeing it, the way things are currently arranged. And we'll talk a little bit probably this evening about oil. I won't do that tonight, but the wealth in the region that comes from oil, people in the region know that that wealth is under their feet and it's being extracted from underneath them, sometimes literally, and they're not invited to share in that wealth in an equitable way. So for the young, unemployment rates for young men and women, and you look at these figures and you see that there's going to be enormous frustration throughout the region. There are still challenges in relation to education, but all the way back from the British days, people have been educated beyond the availability of the employment market to absorb their talents. And the human capital in the region is underexploited. People are sitting around with brains and energy and desire, and they can't find the jobs that will allow them to channel that into something productive. This indicator for people the ages of 15 through 24 who are in the labor market, people who want to have a job, don't have a job. So that's a signal right there that there's going to be, at some point, you're going to have trouble with the young people. A different kind of indicator, per capita water availability in the Middle East and North Africa. We could do similar things in relation to petroleum. Natural resources are already stressed, and they're going to be increasingly stressed. When we look at the Water Security Index and you see those countries that are in the most dire condition, how many of them are coming from the Middle East and North Africa? I'm making a bit of a transition here from what's leading up to the developments of recent months to what's going to happen down the line. And I think it's important to pay attention to that because whatever they accomplish in the region in terms of regime change, in terms of transition to new kinds of government, they're going to continue to face enormous challenges. The people who come into power may satisfy the street in terms of their orientation towards the population, but in terms of delivering a better life, the challenges are enormous. And so these revolutions, whatever they deliver, it's going to be tenuous from the outset. And the problems and the challenges that the region faces are not going to go away, they're going to increase. I think that there's a danger in looking at these developments and believing or even hoping that some magic wand of democracy has been waved over the region and it will now live a healthier and more tranquil existence. I don't see that in the cards, really. And one thing that I would urge is that sensitivity be marshaled to understand the needs of the people of the region in terms of how they're going to relate to their governments and how they're going to govern and be governed. There isn't one formula of participatory democracy which can be draped throughout the region and solve all the problems of governance. It's just not going to happen that way. And so we shouldn't set up false expectations by which we then judge the people of the region and find them failing. That's just a recipe for greater stress in the region and between the United States and the peoples of the region. So I hope we can do a better job than that. In my final 20 seconds, I would say if you want to get a really good sense of what's been going on in the region, you could read a best-selling novel by the Egyptian novelist Ala al-Aswani, The Yacoubian Building, which draws together many of those elements which have brought Egyptian society and other Arab societies to where they are today. It's a book that I use productively in my class each year. It's translated beautifully. It's a great read. The Yacoubian Building will help you to understand why we are where we are. Thanks very much.
JeanDenis Galvan, a professor in political science and international studies, will be our next speaker, and he'll introduce the subsequent two speakers. Dennis is a Fulbright scholar. He has just returned from a year on a Fulbright scholarship studying in Africa, and so he'll speak to many of the issues that you've just heard Shaul speak to. Dennis is one of the co-authors of the Global Oregon Big Idea, and it's an idea that we are using on this campus to foster the study of places outside of the Willamette Valley and the world.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for being here tonight. As David said, this event is also co-sponsored in addition to the Carnegie program. It's also sponsored by Global Oregon and by University Housing. So it's a collaborative effort that brings us all together tonight. I'm a specialist in inspired by Mohammed Bouazizi's sacrifice, who think of his sacrifice as a kind of noble act that needs to be repeated. It has been repeated. It is being repeated on both sides of the Sahara. And I think we're witnessing, as Shaul Cohen crystallized for us, a moment in time when frustration and hope are at a nexus point, are at a powerful nexus point. And for one man to take his life in a visible way, and for that to be the beginning of this rolling event, is really something we should pause and reflect on for a moment. And I want you to know that people around the region are pausing and saying, if he could do it, then it can be done here, it can be done in Senegal, it can be done in Algeria, it can be done in Gabon, it can be done in Morocco, and we are seeing the effects. It makes me think, as I've reflected on what's been going on these last few weeks, of what are we looking at historically? Maybe what we're looking at is the Arab world's 1848. 1848 is the year that comes 59 years after the French Revolution, in which people, middle-class people around Central Europe, Scandinavia, even parts of Eastern Europe said, we are tired of autocracy, we are tired of feudalism, and we will rise up in the spring of 1848 in really the first mass transnational revolutions, inspired by that big event in Paris in 1789, a generation or two before. Maybe what we're seeing in North Africa and the Middle East is an echo. It comes 32 years after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. We're seeing a generation that saw possibility and is taking it upon themselves to move with that possibility. In 1848, if we were talking about 1848, we'd also be talking about new media. We'd be talking about new forms of communication, just like we're talking sometimes in this context about Twitter and Facebook. If this is the Arab world's 1848, then this is going to be a long process. This is going to be a difficult process. And I want to say quickly two more things, one about American foreign policy and one about the future. It strikes me that our administration, our government, could be saying something a little more clearly, which goes along the lines of confession. Look, for a number of decades, this country, despite its ideals, has had to make pragmatic arrangements with various kinds of regimes in the region. Because of oil, because of the Israel-Palestine crisis, because of 9/11, and in some sense, what we might do is simply fess up and say, we had to do this. And now we want to be clearly on the right side of history. And we have an opportunity to do that. And I think in some sense, we're making efforts in that direction. What complicates it, let's not forget, is the tortured place of idealism in our foreign policy. We've lived through 10 years in which I think it's not unfair to say that idealism, words like freedom and liberty and human rights and democracy, were at worst cynically manipulated and at best stretched beyond the limits that those words of honor and dignity should have been stretched. And so for us to come in now and say we want to be on the right side of history requires a kind of exorcism, requires us to work through the fact that our ideals and the possibility to stand with those in Tahrir Square, to stand with Mohammed Bouazizi, to stand with people in Bahrain and Yemen and Oman is difficult, is complicated because what we've done to our own ideals. And in the end, we're going to have to say, look, in certain countries, in the Yemens and the Bahrains and the Syrias, we're going to work behind the scenes. In the Tunisias and the Egypts, we're hoping to stand with those who stand strongly for these principles. And in the Libyas and the Irans, we're going to have to take a different kind of position, which is going to be much more complicated and much more difficult. And finally, I want to echo Shaul Cohen's point about regime change, democracy, and where this is all going. Since the end of the Cold War, we've been deeply enamored with the idea that we know what democracy is, we've perfected it, and we can export it in the best possible way for everyone else in the world. And we all know that there's a tremendous hubris in that notion. But if we think about what democracy really is, the capacity to change your rulers, the capacity to say no to tremendous political outrage and gross violations of the contract between state and society, maybe what we're seeing in Tunisia and in Egypt, and in its abortive attempts so far in other countries in the region, is another version of really popular, grassroots, deliberative democracy, where there may not be regular elections in Egypt, there may not be a rotation of parties, there may not be a strong civil society, but at least at a certain point in time, a new tradition, a new habit of the population saying enough is enough and removing rulers has been put in place. And quite frankly, maybe that's the minimal, least common denominator definition of democracy that we can expect. As Dennis Simon said, that isn't happening in China, but it is happening in this region. And we should celebrate that simple act of saying enough is enough, and we are going to take matters into our own hands as peacefully as possible and achieve a transition of regime. And that alone may be enough of the democratic spirit for us to call the people involved in these struggles our brothers and sisters in some important principles. So with that set of comments, let me, with David's permission, introduce our next commentator, who is Jason Schnur. Jason is a master's student in the International Studies Department, and he has studied and worked in the region for some time. He's here in particular because in January, Jason went off to do his master's research, thinking that he would have a nice and normal internship with the UN Disaster Relief Organization in, of all places, Cairo. And it turns out that Jason had just enough time to get started in Cairo before things started to change dramatically in a way that, of course, no one could anticipate. So one of the reasons we wanted Jason to be on this panel is to show you what you're doing. Most of you are University of Oregon students. University of Oregon students are on the ground. We had a student in Tunisia in December when all of this started, Andrea Bollinger. And we are out there in a kind of global Oregon way, connecting students to these major events in the world. And Jason's going to give you a few words of what he experienced, what this was like to be on the ground as a U of O student trying to do his work in the midst of the world changing underneath his feet.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. As Dennis said, I got an internship with the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction based in Cairo for the Arab states. And one of the main things that I was studying was, as Dr. Cohen had mentioned, was water resource availability in the future and how the region is going to deal with climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction as a strategic policy. It was quite an honor to be invited to sit up here because I don't have near the experience to sit up here, but as a perspective, I happened to be there on the ground and got a bird's eye view of what was happening, and it really changed my perspective as a student, as a graduate student. Before you leave for research in an area like this, in the Arab states, you read so much. There are common themes in the media that we are all pounded with on a daily basis. And then the theories that we build upon as graduate students and write about until you get on the ground and are face to face with something that everybody's been writing about for years, especially in Egypt, this coming revolution. There's going to be a revolution in Egypt. And all of a sudden it just happens. All of that seems very much like fantasy, like storytelling. And not to say that it's very valuable, but there's also a lot of value in the grit and the dirt and firsthand perspective of the people that are fighting for that freedom and for that right to shape their future without the intervention of the quote-unquote international community speculating and trying to manipulate an outcome. And as Dennis said, America, well, at least in my opinion, and from being there and talking with people, has a chance to admit sort of our pragmatic policy choices and come clean with what really may happen in a democratic Middle East. So just real quick, to finish up my perspective, I have a journal entry from when I journaled every day once that revolution began. It was quite an experience. So here I sit listening to the noises outside. I'm a bit nervous. I'm looking at the worn down magenta door, the fragile lock that stands between myself and the mayhem that has erupted outside in the streets. I wonder to myself, how did this happen so suddenly? How did this erupt so incredibly fast? I cannot understand all of the colloquial Egyptian that is being spoken and screamed in the streets. Sure, every few words I understand, but that is more terrifying than hearing the whole context, I think. The bars on my window keep anyone out, but they also trap me inside. I'm not really sure what's going to happen. I probably won't sleep again tonight. The Egyptians are letting loose of decades of pent-up frustration and coerced silence. I think back to the time before I left and the papers I wrote about the media, the history, the theories, the speculation, and it all seems so removed from this imaginary post. Now that I am sitting here smelling the smoke of rubbish burning in the intersections of the roughshod roads, I notice there is one thing missing, the white noise of horns and the daily shouts from the market. I'm watching CNN scramble to put together panels of quote-unquote experts to explain and speculate the outcome of this eruption. It is strange to watch them report from studios in the shades of the stories that are coming forth of Islamic extremism, about the Ikhwan taking over. They seem so ridiculous to me as I sit here. It's as if they only have 2 or 3 correspondent Arabs to speak with, that they ask the important questions and save the rest for the professors and pundits in the West. I was in the cafe just this morning, listening to my friend Ahmed tell me about how Egyptians both respect and admire American freedoms, but they are continually confused and distraught over our unconditional support for Israeli policies of expansion and destruction. I couldn't really give him a reason why the American media is mostly silent about these rude issues, why there is no more dialogue in our media about them. We are eager to jump up as Americans and speak about radicalism and Islamism while ignoring the fuel that feeds much of the recruiting rhetoric in these areas. Another round of gunshots and yelling outside distracts my regression, and I am snapped back to the here, the now. These people are fighting for the right to shape their own future, and I no longer feel that I am welcome here. This seems to have become a private matter for them, one that has been brought out into the public eye, and it is up to these people to finish what they started and not for us to intervene. When I write in the future, I will never forget the importance of asking the hosts what they think of what is happening in their own backyard.
Thank you, Jason. So, with that, I'm going to go on and introduce our next presenter, 2 more presenters who are coming to us from the region. The first is Dr. Walid Musa, who you see here on the left-hand screen. Dr. Musa is a political scientist by training, received his PhD from the University of Florida. I had the honor of being on his dissertation committee once long ago. And Dr. Musa is currently the head of a non-governmental organization called the Governance Bureau, based in Khartoum, Sudan, which has been concerned for the last 10 years with exploring the relationship between Islam and democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is work done under the Omar al-Bashir regime in Sudan, which, as you may know, is not particularly friendly to questions of Islam and democracy. So he's been doing some extraordinarily brave work in that country. I encourage you to look up a YouTube video of a program that he did, a kind of cultural festival to bring together the conflicting parties in the Darfur conflict about 4 years ago. I think of it, if you think of the Darfur conflict as a conflict between herders and ranchers, which is not too far from the truth, Then what you have in what Dr. Musa was doing was a rodeo to try and bring the groups together. And he can say more about how you find that on YouTube. Dr. Musa is about to take up a new position as the director of the Governance Institute in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And he is positioned extremely strategically to give us his sense of how this rolling process of revolution seems to him and to people he talks to in the region. Walid?
Hello. I'm honored to be given this opportunity to address the distinguished audience here. I would want to perceive this revolution, at least conceptually, by looking at the cross-cutting effect of, I would say, ideology and reform, because if you look at the Middle East, I mean, there are three main stages. Mainly the Cold War era, and then the Islamic revivalism, and then the third stage would be the war on terror. These three stages have influenced our ability to move at least ideologically beyond the secular theocratic spectrum, more into the Islamicist spectrum, which became more of a dichotomy between a fundamentalist understanding of Islam and I would say a socio-historical understanding of Islam. And if you look at the experience of Sudan and Iran and some other countries, I would say that we have, at least intellectually, if not practically speaking, we've made a progression more into the rights versus duties spectrum. And in that sense, I would agree with the saying that it's a revolution of dignity and not ideology. I think that is very well put. However, we need not forget about the other cross-cutting factor, which is economic reform, state-oriented reform versus, market-oriented reform. Very few speakers have spoken so far about the negative effect of the Washington consensus. And I think this political vacuum in which the Arab public is moving has been created more by by a combination of illiberal governance structures and I would say neoliberal dictate of the Washington consensus. So in that regard, the whole region is moving in a power vacuum. You have
Small technical snafu. It couldn't have gone this smoothly for this long. He's back.
Here. So should I keep it? You hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I think there is. I would kind of slightly disagree with our speakers in the sense that in Egypt and Tunisia, definitely it's a middle class revolution. However, in other places, I would say that it's a mid of the spectrum group revolution. And in that point, I would want to put emphasis on the fact that these revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt happened because of the regime and not despite of the regime. If you look at Tunisia used to spend 12.5% of its GDP on education and providing provision of educational and health services. Ben Ali, as terrible as he was, he used to spend, combined, the expenditure on health and educational services was 5 times as much as his expenditure on provision of arms. And so if you look at Sudan, that spends about 70% of its GDP on military and secret services. I mean, Ben Ali was excellent. If you look at Hosni Mubarak, I mean, the provision of infrastructure, as terrible as he was, he tried to debilitate the efforts of the civic society to put some democratic reforms to the front, but he did not completely destroy the civic society. I mean, in the case of Sudan and other neighboring countries like Yemen and I would say some other countries like Libya, it's the panoramic picture tells us that there is a major difference between Egypt, for example, and Libya. I mean, if you look at Egypt, you have the state institution was held intact for almost 1,200 years. The civic society was there for like 200 years. Compared to Libya and Sudan, these are countries that have spent no effort to completely destroy the civic society. In the case of Sudan, I mean, Darfur is a case in point. The regime is exploiting the ethnic, cleavages in the region. Now that the South has almost succeeded, the regime has completely succeeded in exploiting the religious cleavages. So I want to say that in some places, there was some ideological tension, and that dialectic is healthy. Now, in the case of Sudan and in the case of some other places in the region, it's not going, the revolution is going to be very militant, and it's not going to happen along the ideological continuum. It's going to happen as a result of the tension between the center and the periphery. These revolutions, to a great extent, have completely exposed the internal colonial structure in countries like Sudan, for example, and Iraq to some extent. Just to give you a very quick example, I mean, the Riverian elites who are ruling the country for almost like 50 years, they have recently built a dam, Marab Dam. The cost was like $1.6 billion, and that, at the very best, that could help us just retain about 18 billion hectares of water. Knowing that had that money been used, we could have built small dams along the country, and that would have helped us retain about almost 1,000 billion cubic meters of water. So right there you see that, I mean, the political structure is negatively influencing the development of the periphery. And without getting into too much specifics, I'm just trying to give that example to elucidate, to explain, to illustrate the fact that these regimes have no consideration whatsoever for the dignity of the human being and for the ability, I mean, for the poor to get just enough to survive. I mean, so in other places, it's a question of dignity, and in some places, it's a question of survival. I would want to put emphasis on the fact that this is, we are witnessing the triumph of idealism. I mean, it's very clear that had the international community pursued some idealist policies, we wouldn't have become in this situation. Also, I want to emphasize the fact that globalization has helped secularize, if not rationalize, the human mind. Because people here, to the extent that the regime is using the slogan of Sharia to suppress the people, the layman is no longer buying that. People are thinking about their rights and their duties, and it's no longer an ideological issue of Sharia. I would totally agree with Dennis in the fact that we need to search, need to work together in an embedded democracy model. Definitely in the cases of Sudan and I would say Libya and some other places like Yemen, you cannot put together a liberal democratic reform in the absence of institutions. There is high level of emotionalism and low level of institutionalism. We need to balance between those two. So I would say that the priority here would be governance and not a very quick dash into democracy. I think the Egyptians are going to face real difficulties because in the absence of institutions, I don't know how democracy is going to be sustainable, especially that 70% of the population, I would say 80% of the population has been completely depoliticized. So
on that note, Walid, we're going to pass to the next presenter, and there will be time for dialogue with the audience, in which period there'll be a possibility to make a few more points. So thank you very much.
As Dennis noted, this is a collaboration among several units, including the law school and the press program. Tim Hicks, who is the director of our conflict resolution program, will introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, David. Hello, Radwan. So Radwan Ali is joining us from the north of Iraq. So that's the Kurdish area of Iraq. And so he brings an interesting perspective because the Kurds are the largest population on the planet without their own state. And the hopes and the inspiration that we all, I think, feel from the events that are happening are maybe particularly salient for the Kurdish people. What does this all mean to them? And I was struck when Dennis was talking about the fact that in a way there's a partnership happening. It's not us watching them do their thing about democracy. It's about all of us thinking about what is the relationship between government and society. And we have to admit that our democracy is not perfect. So we go into the future together, and I think it's partly the that fact that attracts us so much to what is happening. Radwan Ali was here in January as a part of a delegation of Iraqi journalists. He is a Syrian Kurd, but living in Iraq right now, and so can give us perspective both of Syria and the Kurdish peoples. He's very directly connected with a variety of parties involved in the Syrian opposition movement, and as you know, much is happening and bubbling up there. So, Radwan, welcome. Just before I pass the mic over to you, I want to, Radwan is going to speak in English for his opening remarks and then switch to Arabic with questions and discussion. And Abdul Rahman Isa has graciously come to interpret for us. So thank you, Abdul Rahman. And Radwan, the floor is yours. Oh, there. I had, good.
You hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you, team. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you. Thank you, David. And hello, everyone. My name is Radwan Badini. I'm speaking from Iraqi Kurdistan. And it is really great chance, great honor for me to be with you today. My topic is the Kurdish national issue in Syria as part of a democratic process. As you know, Kurdish issue is one of the urgent problems which determine the situation in the Near East, where in parallel to Arab-Israel conflict, which has a half-century history but is not resolved, there exists even a more ancient problem which continued during the entire 20th century and was exacerbated in the last decade of last century. This is the fate of the millions of Kurdish people, the largest ethnos in the world which does not have its own nationhood. The Kurds must struggle for their national rights, political self-determination, and the right to live in the direct sense of the word. Unfortunately, the world community knows little about the Kurds, as well as about the territory where they live. However, this is one of the ancient peoples who inhabited the Middle East and had made a large contribution into the history, culture, and spiritual life of the region, and participated in almost all important events at present and in the past. Kurdistan, the land of the Kurds, is vast territory at the boundaries between the Asia Minor, Transcaucasia plateau of Iran and Mesopotamia. It was divided between Turkey and Iran in the 16th and 17th centuries. And finally, it has been divided as a part of Ottoman remnants between the countries which have won in the First World War, i.e. Great Britain and France. As a result, the southern Iraqi Kurdistan became a part of Iraq under the mandate of Great Britain, and southwestern region has merged with Syria, remaining under the mandate of France. Personally, I am a direct victim of the ruling party Ba'ath in Syria, as during 27 years I have been deprived of the right to return to my own country, Syria, and meet my family. My first visit to the native land gave me possibility to become a witness of the bloody clashes between the Arabs and the Kurds in the city of Kamishli and other regions in the Kurdish province on March 12, 14, 2004. These clashes have triggered an uprising in which 100 people have been killed and about 300 injured. The lack of Syrian Kurds is not discussed by the world community. The official authorities have never recognized neither the fact of the existence of the Kurds problem nor the fact that Kurds live on the territory of Syria, regarding them as come and go people in Syria. The discriminatory policy of the Syrian authorities is also manifested in the fact that a number of Syrian Kurds are deprived of their citizenship. The controversial census undertaken in 1962, especially in the region of Al Jazeera, in which a number of Kurds were stripped of their citizenship, as well as the right to own property, work in state institutions, and be entitled to social security. They are prevented from going abroad without a special approval of the intelligence bodies. The census has also introduced such categories as the decent is understudy and without determination. and people from these categories have no documents at all. At present, Kurds limit the concept of the self-determination to a number of modest general requirements, and they do not aim at the creation of the independent state. The Kurds just require the constitution recognize them to be the second in the context of the number of people, nation in the country. They stand for termination of the discrimination and Arabization, a restoration of the citizenship rights, recognition of national, political, social, and cultural rights, use of the Kurdish language in educational institutions, economic development of the Kurdish areas. The Kurds clearly understand that the solution of their national problems can be found only under the condition of general democratization of Syria, which in termination of the monopoly of the Ba'ath Party on power, repeal of the state of emergency declared in 1963, political amnesty, and establishment of the multi-party parliamentary system. Without any hesitation, we can confirm that continuous abuse of the human rights of the Syrian Kurds is one more argument for granting them some form of self-determination. Today, the situation in the region is difficult and hardly predictable. There is no clearness in respect to the near and remote future of Syria. Further action of the USA, development of events in Syria and Iran, and many other problems existing in the Near East with its conflicts and collisions. In conclusion, whatever the answer might be, one thing is clear. The Near East is on the way toward democratization, stability, and peace. The general democratic principles must be adapted to the Oriental society with the preservation of the fundamentals, sovereignty and self-determination of persons, and sovereignty and self-determination of communities, including national, religious, and other communities. This is the way to freedom and equality. Thank you very much.
If you would please thank our speakers with a round of applause. It's 7 minutes after 8 here on the Pacific Coast, so I thank our colleagues in other countries for getting up early or staying up late. What time is it in Kurdistan?
Early morning.
Early morning, both, yes. So this is the time we have about 30 minutes to engage in a conversation and pose questions. And before I take the first question, I'd like to thank Kevin Hatfield, who is the director of our Community Conversation Series, who's done a masterful job, as he usually does, in pulling all the tech together and making this event happen. So do express your appreciation to Kevin. So questions, comments? And if you would, say who you are and then pose your question.
My name is Kofi. I'm a resident assistant at a housing, and I'm from Africa. I'm part of the African Student Union on campus here, and we've been discussing a lot about what is going on in North Africa. And some of the questions that came up was that looking at Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. In Tunisia, we didn't see anything like rebel movement, the same thing as in Egypt. But what do you think why we do have the rebels in Libya? I don't know, a lot of things have come up when during our conversations at our meetings. And some of us think that because the Western world have interest in Libya, specifically the oil, that's the reason why there are rebels in Libya. Because some of us cannot believe, or we don't know where these rebels are coming from, where they got their arms. So that's my first question. And my second issue is about Ivory Coast, which is where half of my family is from. And there has been a lot going on in Ivory Coast, and we don't see anything being done by the UN. And once more, there was this question that somebody posed, that is it because there's no any resources in Ivory Coast that the Western world is interested in it? Is it because there's no any oil in Ivory Coast, that's why the Western world is staying away from what is happening in Ivory Coast? Thank you.
Possibly throwing some. Okay, I think in my response to speak, I would want to highlight the similarity between Libya and Egypt. I think these are culturally homogeneous societies. I mean, relatively speaking, even though that Libya is more of a tribal society, and that we have to put, I mean, quote unquote tribal, because our understanding of tribalism is different from Islam's use of it. But I think in the case of Libya, the reason why we are witnessing a militant response, more of a rebellion here, is because Gaddafi left no civic conduit through which people can channel dissent. I mean, 42 years of total authoritarianism have completely debilitated the people's effort to work civically. So there was, I mean, he left the Libyan people no option at all. I mean, if you compare him to Ben Ali, for example, I mean, you can say that Ben Ali himself was totally authoritarian, but at least there was some civic conduit. I mean, he did not completely eliminate the civic society nor the political parties.
And
Ivory Coast, do you want to add to Ivory Coast?
maybe we offer Radwan a chance since our guests are from Poland.
Radwan, did you hear the question? Do you have
not clearly, really? If you can repeat, or with translator.
Can you hear me, Radwan?
Translate.
Oh,
Translation. Why?
If it is possible. If it is possible. عليكم السلام ورحمة الله. شكرا.
السؤال: ما شاهدناه في تونس ومصر هو ثورة حقيقية بدون تمرد، فلماذا كل هذا التمرد في ليبيا؟ وهل للبترول علاقة في هذا التمرد؟ تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا. شكرا عبد الرحمن. في البداية مرة أخرى شكرا لكم جميعا. أنا جدا سعيد بهذه المشاركة الرائعة، بهذه الوسيلة الرائعة الخيالية. أنا على بعد آلاف الكيلومترات عنكم وقريب جدا منكم، وأشاهد وأستمع وأناقشكم بشكل مباشر. ممكن ترجم هاي الشيء إذا ممكن مرة أخرى.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to answer this question. I'm miles and miles away, though I'm very close to you. تفضل رضوان.
الحقيقة هناك عدد من الناس يعني المطلعين يفسرون ما حدث في ليبيا والتدخل الغربي والدول الغربية لإنقاذ المدنيين كشكل من أشكال الحرص على مصادر البترول. ولكن أنا أعتقد حتى لو كانت هذه المسألة جزئيا صحيحة، لكننا لا نستطيع أن نسحب هذا الموقف على الموقف السياسي الذي اتخذته العديد أو كل الدول الغربية. نحن مهما كان السبب، الأساس هو أن اليوم نحن نتكلم بلغة واحدة في الغرب، في أمريكا وفي أوروبا وفي الدول العربية، ونتجه نحو أهداف إنسانية لتحقيق الديمقراطية، وهذا هو الأهم.
There is many explanations for what's happening in Libya. Everybody has a different point of view. But from what I see, my own personal view is we had to work together to achieve one thing that concerns everybody, East and West, and this is the search for democracy. تفضل رضوان.
الحقيقة ما حدث في ليبيا يخوف ويعتبر هاجس للكثير من الديمقراطيين في بقية الدول العربية ومنهم بالأخص سوريا.
There is a little concern what's happening in the Arab world, but he is more concerned about what's happening in Syria. تفضل رضوان.
لأننا نخشى من تكرار هذا السيناريو البائس، لأن الشعوب وبالأخص الشعب السوري في المنطقة انتظر على مدى أكثر من 48 سنة انتظر مثل هذه الظروف الموضوعية والذاتية ليقول كلمته وليشهد أيضا حياة سعيدة، حياة لائقة ومناسبة بالإنسان السوري، أي يعيش حياة حرة كريمة ويعتبر بأوسع المعاني الحرية والسيادة الوطنية، ولن يكون كما يقولون أسير حزب واحد ورأي واحد وشخص واحد.
The concern about Syria, it goes back 48 years. The Syrian people are waiting for freedom, for liberty, to have their own say, to participate in the running of the country, and everything is going around them. It deprives them from having a say in the matter.
جملة أخيرة. Yeah.
I'm just
yeah, please. Excuse me.
I'm wondering maybe we could pass on to some other questions. Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and yeah.
شكرا رضوان. Thank you.
Thank you, Radwan. Just two
Thank
quick
you.
things in response to the gentleman's question, the gentleman from Ivory Coast. On Ivory Coast, of course, in the last 3 days, the United Nations and France are doing something. And it's a two-edged sword. The tragedy is that from 2002, from the collapse after the death of Houphouët-Boigny to 2011, almost nothing was done. The two-edged sword, of course, is that Gbagbo has been cornered and slowly isolated until the very moment when France and the UN intervene some 48 hours ago. And at that moment, unfortunately, while we take steps to forcibly remove him, which is the right thing to do because he did lose that election, at the same time, we are playing into the propaganda tools of the Gbagbo regime by giving him exactly the weapon that he needs to say this is yet again an imperialist intervention. So this is complicated. On Libya, I would just add a kind of slightly dissident voice. While I agree with what Dr. Musa, Walid Musa said, one has to remember about Libya that the Gaddafi regime did, to a great extent, wipe out opposition, wipe out organized civil society, but at the same time, this simulacrum, this facade of people's committees, of a rebuilt system of social input through the Gaddafi authoritarian regime is something that we've seen in other countries in the world. And although it's fake, it may provide a basis for the rapid organization of professionals that we've seen in Benghazi around lawyers, around doctors who quickly come together and seem to be forming some kind of nucleus of social organization in the chaos of the rebellion. Maybe there is something that was picked up in the 40 years of Gaddafi regime. We shouldn't dismiss this too quickly. more
Very
questions?
quickly, Kofi, I'm sympathetic to your concern for the lack of attention paid to Côte d'Ivoire. That's a real problem. At the same time, I would say that we have to be wary of the fetish of democratization around the world and the romanticization that we tend to invest in movements that spring up and grab our attention and our headlines. When the television cameras and the news teams move on, our attention flags very quickly. And people in the region are unfortunately accustomed to that, but they rightly feel betrayed when we celebrate them, when we valorize their actions, but when we change the channel, then they no longer are real to us and their cause is not compelling. The historical record says that that's likely to happen in relation to the Middle East. I think the attention being paid to the region now is long overdue, and I hope it sticks around longer than the people there expect.
Can I throw in a very quick remark about Syria?
Please.
Yes, I think in what we're witnessing here in countries where there is a very solid racial and social hierarchy, we should not expect the game to be smooth. It's not going to be civic. I mean, specifically if you speak about Saudi Arabia, where you have about 7 or 10 social strata. If you look at Bahrain is a relatively stratified society, but if you look at Syria, I mean, you do have a sectarian, religious, tribalized, society. I mean, you have the Alawi family, and within the Alawi sectarian group, you do have the family of Hafez al-Assad. And I can't expect Kane to be very civic there. In these places, we should expect Kane to be very, I wouldn't say militant, but I would say that there is going to be serious ruptures along this pyramid of social and racial hierarchy.
Time for 2 more questions from a student.
My name is Aruj, and my question is, what are sort of the implications on Israel? For example, Egypt has had a long history with Israel, and following the Camp David Accords. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Following the Camp David Accords, it sort of established this foundation of this trilateral relationship between Israel, Egypt, and the U.S., and sort of set this trajectory for these alliances between these states and Israel. And so now, what should we expect, or what is Israel thinking, I guess, or what is ideal for them in the circumstances?
Should we collect some questions, David?
What I'm wondering.
Should we collect some questions? So
Okay, yeah, so we'll just have time for 1 more question.
Okay, great.
Aruj, you've asked a good question, but I don't think that's really the question. The question isn't what's Israel expecting, what is Israel thinking. The question is, how do things move forward in relation to the needs of the Palestinians, and how does that happen in a way that allows Israel to go along with it? And that's a challenge for Egypt, as it is for all the countries in the region, because no one has really engaged the needs and interests of the Palestinians in a genuine way. They've been used as political fodder by all the countries of the region, exploited and neglected in various cycles that serve the needs of local elites or are used to pacify the attention of the masses. Egypt has bigger things on its agenda than the Palestinian issue, of course. Egypt needs to take care of Egypt. Every country in the region needs to look to itself. But at the same time, as the Israeli-Palestinian question is a compelling regional and global question, I think that there needs to be some re-engagement. But the first address for that actually isn't in the region, but in Washington, D.C. And when it comes from there in a serious way, then the region can be mobilized, as it has from time to time, to address the needs of the Palestinians and the needs of the Israelis in a constructive manner. Meanwhile, I think everyone is going to continue, for the most part, to neglect that situation as they have neglected it for decades and generations. But I don't at the moment, put that on Egypt. I don't put it on Tunisia. I don't put it on Libya or Syria or Yemen or anyone else. They need to get their own houses in order to the degree that they can and in the way that they see fit. Unfortunately, that leaves the Palestinians hanging a little bit. They're used to that. But again, I think that it has to come from Washington to make that move forward.
For one more question.
Hello, my name is Hassatu. I am a first-year student here. I am from the Gambia, which is very close to Senegal. I see you nodding. And my question is based on the international community. I see that both these speakers blame the international communities for not doing enough. And this doesn't date back in 2011. This also dates back in 1994 during the Rwandan genocide. So I was wondering what can the United Nations or maybe even the United States, what can they do to revise what the international communities do to stop them from not doing enough or even encouraging some of the things that happened? For example, the Rwandan genocide, they were blamed of inciting some of the killings as well. Thank you.
I couldn't hear. If Dennis can just rephrase.
Sure. Can you hear me, Walid?
Yes, I can hear.
The question from our friend from Gambia was, what more can the international community do to prevent these kinds of situations from turning into models along the lines of the Rwandan genocide, and what can be done, I think, constructively to intervene and support the kinds of transformations that we're seeing.
Thank you.
To my friend from Gambia, Jeda Jeffengir Lachabi, and also I'm reminded of the controversy over the U.S. Africa Command. The U.S. recently established a military post headquarters for dealing with the African continent. It's based in Tübingen, Germany. No African country will host it because it's too controversial. However, in the aftermath of Bill Clinton confessing that he did too little in April of 1994, and he paid no attention to the conflict in Rwanda that led to that tragedy of 1 million people, or almost 1 million, being slaughtered, one of the conversations that led to the Africa Command was the idea that the United States would provide communications, transportation, and material and logistical support to the African Union for a rapid response force to go into situations like Cote d'Ivoire in 2002, to go into situations like Libya today, so that you could have African boots on the ground with an African multinational force, which would have to be financed and backed with material, logistics, transport, and communication by the only superpower. But that would be a partnership that would be meaningful. The African Union would be tremendously bolstered, would be challenged to actually take seriously its mandate to stand for human rights on the continent. But it would put some teeth behind the capacity for a regional multinational force to make a difference. And I think that would be an investment of U.S. tax dollars that I'd be proud on April 15th to support.
Dennis, I would want to comment on this. Yes, please. I mean, if you take the case of Darfur, where almost about 300,000 human beings were annihilated, their ecology completely devastated in a period of like 3 to 4 months. I mean, the international community has responded strongly, but not creatively. I mean, if you look at the U.S. spends almost $1 billion feeding the IDPs in Darfur. But that is done to a great extent, I mean, to pacify the American public, which to a great extent is humanist at heart. But I mean, the American administrations, I mean, before this administration, and this administration hasn't done much to shift its focus. They are coalescing with the regime in order to pass this deal of the Southern deal, which is allowing the South to secede in a smooth manner. I think there they are making a mistake, because I mean, the Sudanese public doesn't object to the Southerns, for example, seceding in a democratic way, because they've gone through a plebiscite, and that's their right. But however, for the American administration to coalesce, I would say they are siding completely. I mean, having examined their policies in Darfur, I can say that they are not doing anything major to pressure this regime to shift its policies in Darfur. And then one questions the extent to which the American taxpayer will be able to continue feeding the Darfurian population or the IDPs in specific off the back of the trunk of the car here, or the cars UAE. So here we are witnessing a combination of hypocrisy and humanism, and I think we've come closer than ever to achieving our humanist ideals. Yet our public ought to be very much aware of what their administrations are doing. If you take, for example, the war on terror, let's question the extent to which that war helped bring about a revolution. These revolutions happened despite of the war on terror and not because of it. That these are things that we need to question ourselves. And when we speak about hypocrisy, let us look at let's look at the amounts of billions embezzled into the banks of the so-called civilized West. Why haven't they exposed all of these billions, let's say 3 months ago? Why have they waited for Hosni Mubarak and Ben Ali, and nowadays WikiLeaks have helped us expose the kind of billions that Omar al-Bashir is embezzling in some Western banks? These are things that the public ought to be aware of, and that's how that the West can be of help to these countries that are going through some serious democratic transition. So it's not a question of delivery as much as it is a question of moral legitimacy. It's the moral legitimacy of the international community and the national leaders of our societies that ought to be of concern to us. And we need not completely restrict ourselves to delivery, the ability of the international community or the national elite to deliver to the public. Thank you, and I apologize for taking much.
Not at all, not at all.
David has asked me to offer a final thought, and I would just say this. There's a tension in this country between the desire to have a foreign policy based on ideals and a foreign policy that's driven by resource needs and political pragmatism. One of the elements that's been alluded to in the situation currently is the articulation by President Obama of a need to protect Libyan citizens. And the responsibility to protect is an important emerging concept in international governance. And I hope that that element of it can transcend the events in the region of recent months and in fact serve as a guide for people in power around the planet, that the politics doesn't come first, the welfare of the people of the planet comes first, and that will in turn create a new kind of politics. And hopefully that can inform people's impressions of what foreign policy is here and drive our politics as well. One of the things that makes America a fortunate place is that people of the world are patient and eager to partner with us. They recognize our strengths, and they've been remarkably tolerant of our failings. They want us to be on their side, and I think we genuinely want to be on their side. We just have to figure out how to do that a little bit more effectively, and I think if we can do that, everyone who is a champion of democracy will be more content. Thank you.
We again would thank our guests and our speakers. And the events of tonight will be online, available on DVD, I believe, competing with Justin Bieber for competition. And you can also visit our website sometime in the next week or so. So thank you very much, and our speakers will remain for a moment if you want to pose questions to them. Again, thanks a lot for coming out.